Welcome all. I'm going to start with the roll call. Angie Manetti, Greg Brown, Angela Levin,
Here.
Nicole Wilkinson, Liz Ash, Wendy Brand, Myron Eng, Michael Steele, Carrie Bailey.
I'm here.
Oh, good. Renee Wasserman, Kristen Power, Nicole Quiznos, Terry Thomas, Tom Myers, Polly Fromini, Kristen Alster, Scott Reich, John Benton, Gavin Pendleton, Rick Brausch,
Here.
Jake Ross,
Here.
Megan Cambridge, Monica Wagner, Ron Pillarin, Tommy Asu.
Here.
Okay. Bob Fuji, Nicholas Oliver, Brian Heiser,
I'm here.
Kristen Fitzgerald, John Schofield, Ed Ochoa.
Here.
Thank you. Margarita Padilla, David Idy.
Here.
Thank you. William Fallon.
Here.
Thank you. Rachel Wagner, Paige Brokaw, Heather Tanner, Murray Wooden, Romina Scheiss, Cher Wu, Michelle Henry, Larry Switzer.
Here.
Thank you. Brittany Atkins, Andrea Ventura, Heidi Sanborn.
Here.
Thank you. Edward Moreno, Carlos Gutierrez. Thank you all. With that, I will move on to the agenda. Oops. Anybody who I missed?
Holly for me, and I'm on the line as well.
Okay, thank you.
Matt Cannon from Greenberg Chartered on the line. Is now joining.
Okay.
Nina, I think Kristen Alsted's got you on mute. She's going through security, but she'll be back with you shortly.
Oh, okay. All right. Thank you.
And Matt Williamson and Chris Hennessy are here for Rite Aid.
Okay, Matt. Thank you, Matt.
Larry
Anybody else?
Sir is now exiting. Andy Fix from Procter & Gamble.
Hey, thanks, Andy.
Heather Tanner from Sacramento County.
Okay, thank you, Heather. Anybody else? Okay, thank you. Sorry?
Brian Lindman from USC Ecology.
Ryan, can I get your last name again?
Lindman, Lindman.
Okay,
Thank you.
thank you.
Cliff Georges, CSPA.
Thank you. Okay. With that, I'll move on to the agenda. And as we know, in the last meeting, we were going to get some updates on legislation, AB 514. And there was going to be a hearing, and we will hear about that one. We are also going to talk about consensus statement and donations. And I did receive a copy of report from Michael and Myron, and I think the consensus
Is now joining.
for manufacturer's credit and for partially empty containers. And Scott, I think yours is on the manufacturer's credit is also included in the report copy that was sent. Am I correct?
That's correct, thanks.
Okay, great.
Nina, this is Myron. I just wanted to
Romina? Yes.
Is now joining.
wanted to make a point of clarification that the role that I played and that Michael, I think, as well, in terms of the recommendations and findings was solely to collect comments and recommendations and edits from the subcommittees. So we were really just more or less putting together rather than statements from ourselves.
Okay, right. And we do have copies for people who walked into the room. I made the copies of the report and agenda and the donation consensus statement. They are at the back table over there. So with that, we would go over just briefly on what we did last
Is
time.
now exiting.
We are going to get an update on legislation, and we also looked at consensus statement for manufacturer's credit last time, and then the updates are done after that discussion. We also shared a brief starting point for the report, and that report has been updated as we just
Bob
discussed.
Fuji is now joining.
So with that, I would like to start. Do we have any other additional comments, Rick or Megan, which I may have missed? So we move on to the first agenda item, which is the legislative updates. And last time we looked at AB 514.
Actually, Nina, okay, I thought we were on the first agenda item, which was beyond the business and into the welcome. So if I could at least take a moment in that particular first agenda item, a couple of statements just to kind of
Yes.
to open us up. I appreciate, and like I said, what we've been doing over the past several months, many meetings, 3 years. There's been a significant amount of work and effort put into a variety of people, in this group, outside this group. Like I said, I think it's represented at least good faith efforts on everybody's part to try to grapple with some very significant issues. As you might imagine, until and unless something kind of goes onto a piece of paper, it's, let me rephrase that. When something goes onto a piece of paper, it may necessarily take on additional perspective, new life, new realization of what it is and how it carries. So one of the things that I definitely wanted to at least specify here as we
John Anderson, McLean.
As we look at this,
Is now joining.
we look at this, the compilation of our efforts. First and foremost, I think it's important to make clear that while, as we've spoken of consensus, I think that's an aspirational goal. I don't know that necessarily all of these issues, all of the represented views in the report will be consensus. I think it's important that the report, to the extent, and the compilation of our efforts to the extent we can, represent places where we agree. And I think it's important that to the extent we can find agreement, that we identify those and come to common purpose. That said, given the breadth and nature of participants in this process, as you might imagine, there's going to be things, ideas, elements that are not going to have consensus. There's going to be differences of opinion. So one of the things that this report didn't, at least the draft report that was put out, didn't state clearly, which we will be adding in, is a disclaimer that the views in this report do not necessarily represent everybody. I mean, they only, but only as, so noted. So again, consensus, to the extent consensus was achieved, that will be represented. To the extent not, we'll have to do our best to try to attribute, but just because it's in this report doesn't mean it's the view of someone in this work group necessarily. So we're gonna have to disclaim and basically caveat that, so people who are participating don't feel constrained that somehow, some way, what's in this report that we've all been working on necessarily represents their views if they either strongly or vehemently disagree. The challenge for us as we write this is how do we capture the breadth of those views in ways that can become constructive and lead us to recommendations. So, and the nature of herding these cats, as we all know, is how do we get us to a point where a written document can represent our common interests, but at the same time not imply consensus, agreement, or a position that some may or may not hold. So I just wanted to preface all of this, and my assumption is that there's not disagreement on that, but I would be happy to open discussion on that as we put a whole effort into context. So was there any feedback on that? Okay, I see Michael has moved towards his microphone, so I will take that to be a comment is forthcoming.
Yes, so this is Michael Steele. Thank you, Rick, and I appreciate your comments.
What?
Could be.
You need water?
Hello?
Yeah, there you go.
Nope, I'm good. Okay, let's have a.
Can everyone,
Okay, so
please
it's
mute
Michael
too,
Steele
please?
speaking, and those of you on the telephone, it would be great if you muted yourselves because we're getting a lot of background interference. I just wanted to say that I appreciated Rick's comments, and I think that Exhibit A for your point is the markup of the
John Anderson,
foundation
McLean.
statement, which basically
Now exiting.
eliminated, by my word count, roughly 95% of the words that we had put there in the first place.
But you got 5%.
Yeah, right. And all of the meanings. So that illustrates that there's no consensus on this point. And so how do we go about proceeding from there? I think what we need to do is to present the opposing views. I would like to see our March draft go back in, or actually it's February 27th, draft of the donation statement, go back into the document, and people can say they disagree with it, but that represents the consensus of certainly the regulated community, and I think that some of the regulators were on board with it as well, but that's for them to decide. But I think the report now devolves into opposing views on, where we go on some of these issues. Now, on others, there may be consensus, and that's great. I would like to see us achieve consensus. But since now at, 5 minutes to midnight, we find out that we don't have consensus on this, I see that there's nowhere really for us to go other than to have sort of dueling statements as to what the best way to proceed is. I think that you need to at least acknowledge that the regulated community considers there to be problems and goals. And so perhaps even on that level, there could be consensus to a part of our statement. As to the resolution, it's apparent that there are disagreements about that, and that's fine. It helps us to know that this is not something that is likely to be resolved through guidance. We have to go back the legislative route. And, at last, we now know that. So I guess that's kind of where I see it going. And as Myron said, he and I consolidated, and sorry we gave you two versions of the report. It's really the same version. He just added more changes that I'd missed on top of what I'd submitted. So, and that, of course, was just based on what we got as terms of feedback. And if there's other feedback that needs to go in there that either strengthens consensus or distinguishes positions, we're fine with that. I think that Macon gave us a good running start on this report. I think we've gotten a lot of input from the subcommittees. And so let's focus on where we agree and where we disagree and memorialize that.
No, thank you, Michael. Again, like I said, just the challenge for a group of this size and its diversity is always in how do you come up with a common product at the end. And so I think at a minimum, if there can be at least some measure, and my goal, my hope would be some measure of agreement that there is a problem, because if we don't agree that there's a problem, then all the rest of the discussion about whether or not certain solutions might be reasonable or pursuable becomes somewhat meaningless or moot. So again, I mean, I appreciate the level of effort all have put into getting us where we are, and I think I just feel compelled to at least respect the fact that there may be those in the group that may not necessarily agree with certain things.
now joining.
So how do we characterize and cast this and capture that? I think the nature of the feedback, Michael, and others that you've been getting is it's kind of emblematic of the challenge, right? I mean, essentially, there are differing viewpoints, and the fact that there are differing viewpoints has led to some of this natural tension and challenge of trying to manage forward through this process. So maybe it should come as no surprise that we're still at least grappling at some fundamental level. The hope, like I said, as we all entered into this, was that we could come to some measure of common agreement. And through my strong arming, trying to get us to at least to a common problem statement definitions. So to the extent that we can capture that, we will attempt to capture that. To the extent that anybody who's participating in this process feels strongly and wants to ensure that their views to the contrary or even aligned with, we can make that known and how we can characterize that in this written document so that the reader, whomever that might be, whether it's a member of the legislature, member of the regulated community or elsewhere, they at least have an accurate representation of what we spent our time doing, how we attempted to fulfill the spirit and the meaning of the legislation which chartered us in the first place, and then how do we come to some resolution and for path forward. So again, I appreciate everybody's efforts, and to the extent that we can, we'll continue to try to facilitate this forward to a document that we can all at least honestly and fairly say represents us in our collective effort.
Rick, this is Ed Ocho. I'd like to speak to that point.
Okay, sure, Ed.
And I do appreciate you saying that at the beginning. I certainly have attempted during the times that I've been able to participate to articulate at least my view with respect to some of these issues, my view of current law under the HWCL, and certainly a view that differs from the perspective of the retail industry. So in quickly reviewing the draft report, I received a copy of it last night. I didn't have time to carefully review it, but I was quite startled by a lot of the statements that I believe, in my opinion, are incorrect or baseless. But most troubling was what you mentioned, is that this document, at least in this draft form, does represent that these statements in the report are consensus statements, or that they are otherwise attributed to the members of the Retail Waste Working Group. At page 2 of the report, for example, the report indicates that these are the findings of the Retail Working Group. And in fact, in my view, certainly, and probably in the view of other regulators, including prosecutors, CUPA representatives, and perhaps even DTSC, it isn't the view of the regulated agencies that enforce this law. For example, at page 23 of the report, it states that California's hazardous waste criteria are unnecessarily stringent without evidence of increased protection of human health and the environment. That statement, again, is characterized as either a consensus statement or attributed as a finding of the Retail Working Group, which again is comprised of various stakeholders, including regulatory agencies. As a prosecutor, I certainly do not agree with that statement. So I think it is very important to make sure that if there are positions articulated in this report, and those positions are from the perspective of the retail industry, I'm not trying to muffle or stifle those representations. They just need to be attributed to the appropriate parties so that there is no misimpression that these statements are the view of the working group in totality. So I appreciate you making that clear.
And Ed, I appreciate that. And like I said, I think in essence, like I said, that discomfort, if there is that measure of discomfort, I think we just need to all review it with that eye towards if there's common ground, let's identify it. If not, then let's essentially make sure that the problem as it's characterized is at least fully understood. Whether or not we all agree from the perspective of our various seats, that's a different question. But appreciate that those comments, Ed, and we will definitely be looking at this with, as we move forward. Again, this is one of the risks of just taking kind of the various working products and kind of putting it under one cover, and then it looks different as a compilation and kind of has different weight than what it was in its various pieces and parts.
So this is Michael again. I certainly appreciate what Ed has said as well. I would note that what we gave to you was sort of a proposed consensus, not that we had reached any ultimate conclusions. Also that this reflected the input that we got as of the time we put this together, and was not intended in any way to foreclose further input. I think that seeing that consensus has broken down, we may actually on our side of the table want to go back and revisit some of the consensus statements because they represent compromises that we would not otherwise make if we were simply stating our position. So we will go back with that in mind, and we would invite whoever has disagreements to submit opposing view, and we'll not call these consensus statements anymore. We'll call them, except where we are actually able to reach a consensus, which I hope on some single issue we might. But I think that's the way that this is evolving. We'll go back and we'll take another run at this report to clarify our perspective, deleting the word consensus, and opposing views can be expressed accordingly. We got to move this thing forward, and we've worked for 3.5 years to reach these consensus views, and now we are where we are, and we got to close this thing out. So I think the message that we're getting loud and clear is that there's not consensus on many key issues, and that's fine. But let's articulate what the opposing views are, and we'll articulate ours better as well.
This is Ed Ochoa. I agree with that statement, Michael. But just wanted to point out, it's not just simply removing the indications that the following are consensus statements. It's the indication in the beginning of the report that indicates that these are actual findings of the Retail Waste Working Group, when in fact a lot of these findings are incorrect or assertions that are frankly baseless.
Well, there are ones that you disagree with. I think you're going too far when you say they're incorrect or baseless. That's not fair to us. But as far as the consensus statement or the findings provision, that's the boilerplate that we were given. We didn't really pay any attention to that part of the report, and we're fine with deleting it. That's fine.
Well, of course, we all have to agree in terms of how these positions are represented. And so I'm making clear that the opening pages of this report indicate that these are findings of the working group. And in fact, if there are statements in this report that members of the working group simply do not agree with for whatever reason, they shouldn't be considered findings, again, or otherwise considered as consensus statements.
And I think I just said we're all in agreement with that. Let's delete that part of the report.
Well, again, it's not just deleting things from the report, but making clear that if there's statements in here that are only attributed to the retail industry perspective, that be made clear in the report.
I think we all agree with that, Ed.
Great.
Yeah. We will go through it.
You say your piece, and we'll say ours.
Yeah.
And we'll do this again for another couple of years.
Is now exiting.
To the extent, I mean, clearly the introductory information was our attempt to at least capture, like I said, I recognize that our hope as represented in our efforts would be closer to consensus, and I'm still not giving up on the possibility that there are some elements of our common work product that can be represented as common interest. I'm not going to say, obviously we can't force anyone to accept something that they're not willing to accept, and I'm not here representing that we will. Ed, your comments are well taken. We will look throughout all the introductory statements to ensure that each participant in the work group is able to preserve its substantive individual role and responsibility, and that to the extent that attribution needs to be made so that it's clear to the reader who it is that's speaking on behalf of and what their views represent, I think it's a good edit, and we will look throughout the document to make that, to accomplish that goal. Again, my hope is still that even in today's discussion, we can at least find common ground on some things and ways in which we can represent that there is mutual interest in some of these, even if, and only if, it's in the recognizing a common problem. That whether or not we understand or fully agree on how it's a problem or what causes it to be a problem, that they may be less consequential, but we'll make sure to the extent we can on expressing internal to the document what those what the problem definition is from the various participants. Okay. So again, thank you all. Like I said, this issue is not without its challenges, and I appreciate everybody's forbearance in this process. And hopefully, it's not viewed as in discouraging or a disheartening way. Like I said, I still think there's lots that we can accomplish, even in the context of a report and a common set of findings that can propel us in a direction towards some measure of resolution. So I'm holding out hope. I hope join with me in that hope, and we'll see where this leads in the last, not necessarily, I don't think it's 5 minutes till midnight, Michael. I think it's still like 11 o'clock. I think we still have an hour. So we still have the remainder of May to really work on this, and my hope and my commitment is let's see what we can do to pull that common interest together. So with that, there is next on the agenda the legislative update. Is that where we are, Nina?
Right. So we move on to the second item, should be on the legislative update. Can we get somebody who can give us a little brief information on what happened in is it John?
Yeah, thanks, Nina. I don't know if Angie's on or Mandy, but the bill was heard on the 26th and passed out of Assembly Environmental Safety Committee on a 7-0 vote. It now goes to the Assembly Appropriations Committee, and that's kind of the status of it right now.
Yeah, John, this is Angie. Thank you. That's pretty much exactly what had transpired, and I imagine that this will continue just to be the bill that we will move forward for this year. I'm not sure if we anticipate any additions unless, unless the recommendations from the report signal that something should be done this year. That I'm anticipating that it will move relatively smoothly through the process. I don't think we had any opposition come out. No members had any concerns about the language. So, yeah, that's our update.
Thanks, Angie. And this is Rick Brosh again. And just to make it abundantly clear, we offer this opportunity to update on the bill status simply because of the interest, a common interest of the many participants. Clearly, we, as part of the administration, as other constitutional offices, don't represent positions and will not be able to represent a position. So whether or not, our discussion of it does not represent any endorsement or otherwise position of approval, disapproval, or otherwise on the bill. That said, I think we'll also need to look at, and Angie, kind of in response to your point, if the report does, I can almost guarantee you, actually I will guarantee you, that the bill will make no representation from at least from the interests of the state agencies in terms of recommending legislation in and of itself. I think what we will be forecasting is if there's a recommendation on solution, it'll be more of a framework of what a solution might look like, not necessarily a vehicle or method by which that solution would be carried out. Just as a forecasting for you. It's just, I'm obligated to kind of give you that line. As I've said before, my apologies for the mendacity and the repetitiveness of my statements, but sometimes I must do what I must do.
Understood, Rick.
You didn't really mean mendacity, did you?
I may have just been.
Okay. Thank you all for that. And then moving on to the third item, which is the consensus statement on donation. I will move this on to Jay Cross. He has worked on some document here, and we have also received one document from Michael. Jay.
Okay, so this is Jay Cross. So I did keep the consensus statement draft on top there. I'm hoping we can still get to some consensus. So what I tried to do with this is try to basically state that, look, if it's a product, it's not something that we would regulate under HWCL. Right? Anything that's a product, you can do what you want with it. You can sell it, you can resell it, or take it off your shelf and ship it off to another location. You can go through your reverse distribution process, or your own, or the company retailer's own infrastructure for taking their products. Again, if it's a product, it doesn't fall under HWCL. The only time it would fall under HWCL if it's discarded, and that's defined in statute. Is something is discarded if it's going to be, if somebody makes a decision, we need to dispose of this, we need to discard it. So that's one way that something is discarded. Another way it's discarded is by if it's broken or leaking, it would be considered a discard under the statute. If it's mislabeled and that labeling is not corrected, and it also, of course, for both of those last two situations, if it poses a danger to the health and environment, then that would also be a discard. So that's pretty much it. I mean, I think there are ways that there are some issues that would arise here as far as if there's any speculative accumulation or something is inherently waste-like. That would be something that we would look at as that's probably going to be a waste or is a waste at some point. So if you guys have any comments, anything you want to talk about.
Yeah, Jay, first, thank you for your work on this. I've scoured that revision. I've read it a couple times, and I'm afraid that what I see is that it largely just restates the law. And as I think we've made clear before, just kind of cutting and pasting the law and saying when it's a product, it's not regulated, and when it isn't a product and it's discarded, it is regulated. We've read the statute for the last couple of years, but we still have people who are, and I'm sorry to use the word, confused, uncertain as to how it applies in the donation context. And I just really don't see anything that answers our question as to when, in the examples that we gave you, that says that it's something that's donatable, that's not broken and leaking, that is still a product, even if it's later discarded by the reverse distributor. I just don't see anything that answers that. So if you can answer that in the document, it would be incredibly helpful, but I didn't see anything in there that says that.
Okay, so can you restate your question?
Okay, so we've given you these examples where our understanding is, one of the areas that was in question was what happens if a product is shipped to a reverse distributor that looks perfectly fine, it's not broken or leaking, and the reverse distributor ends up discarding it. Was it a waste back at the store? Do you have to know at the store that it's going to be donated? And if it isn't donated, well, then it was a waste back at the store. That was the question I think that was asked. Okay, so and I don't see an answer to it in the document.
Okay, so basically what I'm saying here is, and I tried to set it up in the first paragraph, saying that if it's a product, again, if it's not broken or leaking, then we have nothing to do with it. I mean, you can do whatever you want with it, but it's until it's discarded, and that's kind of where I was.
But when is it discarded? That's the question. So saying it becomes a waste when it's discarded, that's the question that we've been asking for 3 years.
So in your scenario, if, for example, if I'm a retailer, I have a product that I want to donate, and I'm going to send it for donation, right?
Or you just can't sell it. Remember, you're the retailer. You can't sell it, is all you know. You're sending it to the reverse distributor to find a home for it.
So we're talking about a product that's perfectly good.
Yeah.
It's not expired. There's nothing wrong with it. It's in good packaging. It's properly labeled. It's a product, and you want to dispose of it. You want to donate it, right? So you're donating it. Again, you're not under hazardous waste control law. right? Because it's still a product. It doesn't come into our purview. But let's say, for example, I send it back to the reverse distributor or to another location. That's still perfectly okay because it's still a product, right?
Can you say that in the guidance? Because point me to where it says that.
Well,
and if not, would you be willing to say it in the guidance? Because again, just saying until it's discarded begs the question as to when that point occurs. That's what we're trying to.
That's kind of what I tried to do in the second page.
Okay.
Paragraph 1 too. Even in the middle of paragraph 1, it says these products may be donated for use, sold to a secondary market, wholesaler, returned to a retailer's distribution system to be later offered for sale at another retail location. And products are not waste and are not governed by HWCL until they have been discarded.
Okay. And when are they discarded?
And that's kind of what the second page is about, right? They're discarded when the middle of that paragraph in the second page, it says products may be sent through the reverse supply chain for donation or salvage. However, should a product become a waste, it cannot go through the reverse supply chain to be donated or salvaged. Products become a waste when a decision to discard the product is made. So when that decision, so hold on, when the product gets to, let's say, the reverse distributor, and then at that point they decide, you know what, this is going to be discarded now, then that's when it becomes a waste, and that's when you need to follow HWCL.
That'd be great. Can you say that, just what you said now, can you put that in writing?
I thought that's what I just did.
Okay, well, I'm not, I guess, we would prefer that you said it the way you just said it now.
If I may, it might be helpful to provide, if I may, this is Jeff Leacox, it might be helpful to provide some example scenarios and identify the point in that scenario. So just exactly what you said, but put it into the real world of retailer, reverse distributes, reverse distributor, evaluates, decides, and at some point it becomes waste.
I think that's an excellent suggestion.
Okay. But at the same time, I think we were talking about eventually doing a guidance document, which in that case may give us a better opportunity to do the scenarios that further express those different scenarios that could occur.
Well, I don't think we're trying to write the guidance document here, but I think fleshing this out is exactly what we want to know. I think we in order to see if there's consensus, we need to see how we handle these scenarios. These are the scenarios that are causing people trouble. They send something to reverse distributor because it hasn't sold to the retailer, and then it turns out no one needs the shampoo anymore, and there's no market for it, or something like that.
Well, would you agree that the same product could become a waste at the retailer because they intend to discard it right then and there?
Well, I think that's a subject outside of the scope of this one. I don't necessarily agree with that, but for purposes of this issue, I think we just say that that's not what we're dealing with. Because you'll see that scenario is dealt with in the credit document, but for donation purposes, I think we're trying to keep this limited to those. And the scenario we just want to get addressed is where there's nothing about the product, there's nothing wrong with the product when it goes to the reverse distributor, and the reverse distributor does not know that it's going to be discarded, they're sending it to the reverse distributor, and the reverse distributor is the one that discards it. Then we want it clear that was not a waste at the store. So if we can ask that question and get that answer, I think that would be very helpful. And I've heard you say it in the room a couple of times, right. And I know you think it's clear, and I appreciate that. But for those people who have been dealing with this for a couple of years, I can tell you that just reading that, it's a waste when it is discarded, they're going to ask me, well, when is that? So if we can really hit this scenario and be clear about it, I think we can do a lot of good, and not just for industry here, but for, I know I'm here representing an industry client, but I think we also have to be mindful of the fact that there are lots of people out there who rely on these products in their daily life who cannot afford them. And I think we really should be thinking about trying to help them.
So this is Ed Ochoa. Just to speak to that point, I think some of the comments have requested a need for examples, and that goes to a point that certainly I've made in previous meetings, that when you're asking the question, well, okay, when is the product discarded? When is it considered discarded? It really is dependent on the product and the facts in terms of how that product is being handled
is now exiting
by the person there at the retail store and how that product will be managed, handled, or potentially discarded as it goes back through the reverse logistics chains. For example, pharmaceuticals, right? EPA has stated in the proposed rule that pharmaceuticals that go back through the reverse logistics that are going to be incinerated are discarded, and discarded at the point of where those pharmaceuticals are located, the facility itself. So it really is dependent on the facts. If there is an absence of facts indicating that the product is considered discarded under the law, then, as Jay is indicating, that product is a product. But you can't have a document that speaks to every hypothetical, every product, every conceivable way in which that product can be managed, and in some instances considered discarded. You're just not going to be able to do that in a document. The best I think we can do is look to the law and say, okay, these are the standards that we can apply to. Now let's look at the facts. Under these facts, this product is considered a product because there is no factual support for the position that it's considered, quote, discarded. Under a different set of facts, that same product might be considered discarded, right, because it's discarded because it's going to be disposed of, or it's discarded because it's going to be recycled. So you can't really expect either Jay or DTSC or anyone, frankly, to state in a document all of the different ways in which a product, quote unquote, will be considered discarded. That's just not possible.
Yeah, and this is Michael, I certainly agree with that. What would help, though, is if we had a couple of examples that we could extrapolate from. And the hypothetical that Scott and others were outlining, let's flesh that out. At a retail store, there are a dozen bottles of shampoo in good condition, not expired, perfectly saleable, but they have been not moving on the shelves, and the retailer wants to put other stuff on that shelf. So they're pulled back. They go to the back room. The clerk says, these look like they might have some value. Maybe they could be donated. Maybe they could be sent in a secondary market. I don't really know, and I don't deal with 12 bottles of shampoo at a time. I'm going to put these on the pallet that goes to Reverse Logistics, Inc., because they're in the business of figuring out whether it has a donation opportunity
Is now
or
exiting.
a liquidation, resale to a second seller, and so I send it off to them. The reverse logistics provider takes this product, looks at it, decides, you know what, in this small quantity, there's really not a donation pathway that makes sense for us. There's not a secondary market that makes sense for us, so we're going to discard it. That's the hypothetical, and if we can write that up and get the answer to what point in that sequence of events it becomes a waste, I think the answer is at the reverse logistics process or where the decision to discard is made. There have been situations that we have faced where the interpretation has been, no, if it ultimately gets discarded, then that is retroactive up the chain to the retail store because they should have known that that was its ultimate disposition. That's the problem that we're trying to grapple with. If we could get a clear answer on that, that would be a victory, for all of us to have some clarity on that point.
So at the point of generation would be when the reverse distributor decides this is going to be discarded.
So if we can put that example into the document with that response, that would be helpful, because what happens is people are concerned that it will have some retroactive upstream effect, so they decide those 6 bottles of shampoo, we're going to dispose them at the store level because that's the safe thing to do. We won't get accused of transporting hazardous waste or sending it to an unlicensed facility if in case it does ultimately get disposed of.
So if you have a product at the store, you take it off the shelf, you put it in the back shelf in the back. I don't think that necessarily makes it a waste. It's still a product. You can still do whatever you want with it. You can restock it in the same store the next season if you want to. You can send it to another retailer, or you can send it to another location. You can do whatever you want because it's product. It doesn't fall under HWCL, right? If somebody doesn't make a decision on that, I don't think we have the authority to force you or to tell you, well, you need to make a decision that this is a waste or not. That's your product. It's like, I'm not going to go into your house and tell you, well, you need to throw this out. That's not going to happen.
So
As I was on the flight up here, I think it's page 2, I guess it's second paragraph. The last sentence in the paragraph says, I think exactly what we're getting at is that the decision is made it becomes a waste when the decision is made to discard. That's great.
Right.
Our problem from the retail side is the previous paragraph,
Which
is that forward-looking. However, should a product become a waste, it cannot go through a reverse supply chain to be donated or salvaged. That's a problem. It's a answer that no retail employee has at the time that they're trying to make it. And so if we could strike that, I think that goes a long way towards Scott's point. And if we can add in some of these specific examples that, I mean, those two sentences are contradictory, I guess is my point.
Well, not necessarily. We're saying that we're reinforcing that if it is a waste already, whatever that point was, if that decision was already made at the store, then you can't go to the reverse distribution center, right?
Well, so it says should become a waste, right? If it is a waste, I understand that.
Okay.
That premise, but if it should become a waste, it's forward-looking, and that's our problem from the retail
And here's the thing. So let's say, for example, like in our example here with the product going back to the reverse distributor, and it's going for donation, right? So it's still a product, doesn't go under HWCL. But at that point, like when the reverse distributor says, there's no market for this, we need to discard it. So at that point, it does become a waste, and that's kind of what I'm trying to get to. At that point that it becomes a waste, then it needs to be managed under HWCL, right? So should it become a waste at some point, then at that point that it does become a waste, then it falls under HWCL and should be managed accordingly.
Yeah, maybe certainly, but that product has gone through reverse distribution to make that determination, which this statement says
So at the point, for example, that it's in the reverse distribution process and then it becomes a waste, it can't stay in that reverse distribution process any longer. It has to be managed under a manifest and transported by, that's kind of what I'm trying to get at. So, I mean, if you have a suggestion on how to rephrase that, I could take that.
Okay, so I think part of the challenge here is, and I think we just need to kind of focus back on what is this document we're trying to write and how do we write it? So essentially, I think we began the process here of defining for all of us what the nature of this problem is. And I think this may be a whole lot simpler than we're trying to make it, because I think what this discussion represents is the fact that it's not inherently clear. The point is, this issue isn't inherently clear. There are retailers being forced to or feeling as though they need to make decisions in the field because the uncertainty that exists around this very issue. Because of that, they are choosing to waste. They're choosing to discard materials which could otherwise be donated or salvaged. However, collectively, we can envision circumstances under which these are not wastes, which essentially then begs the question of, well, what's the recommendation? The recommendation is to develop guidance which clearly identifies those circumstances and patterns of fact which would allow the use of this material in a continued fashion as donation or salvage and not be considered waste. Do we then need to go through this process of trying to identify all of the different permutations and fact patterns at this point in time, or can we just agree that there's a problem? There may be some opportunities for solving this through some sort of guidance and direction that can be given to retailers, and then we can move on and let the implementation of this recommendation kind of form the basis for additional conversations around scenario building, laying out particular retailer guidance which can help form the solution. Because of the nature of this, in the interest of our time and available time, and the fact that we're at 11 o'clock and midnight's coming, how do we get to this point of coming to, I'm of the interest of, can we agree there's a problem? And I think it seems as though there's some agreement that there's a problem. I'm going to declare victory somewhere.
So I think, this is Scott, I think that all makes sense. The one thing I would say is, we've been talking about this issue for months, and we actually heard a scenario, which is the scenario that we really care about understanding how the law applies. And I hear the department saying that under that scenario, they agree with our resolution. To me, it would be a mistake to just leave that on and go past it. I think we should get that written up, and I would say, I'm not asking that we address every scenario. I know there are a zillion fact patterns. I totally agree with Ed on that. But this is one that we really care about. It seems like there's consensus on it. I would hate to just leave it and hope that we'll come back to it later and get it right next time. I mean,
So to the extent that in the document, we can say that there are fact patterns, there are scenarios we envision, for example.
Yes.
That can actually, would that be a technique that would potentially accomplish at least that low-hanging fruit to the extent we can get everybody to look at that?
I think it would. I mean, what we're really looking for on this is to know to get some firm indication that this can be resolved by guidance. Because if it can't be, we got to go to the legislature. Well, and I think if you answer this question, we would get that warm, fuzzy feeling that we're looking for.
But I guess the point I have to come back to, Scott, is not everything will be fixable or resolved through guidance. I think what we need to recognize here is that there are facts that I think can be either made clear, but there are going to be some areas where there may not be agreement. So I'm trying to understand here where that, if we need to resolve where that line is before we can proceed down this path of how we characterize this document or this recommendation, that kind of defines for us the problem statement related to these problem statements. But what I'm hopeful is that, this one, if there's any low-hanging fruit that doesn't necessarily force us to agree that guidance can address every possible scenario that we're envisioning. I'm trying to figure out here where's the scope of this document, where's the scope of what we're trying to capture here, so that we can all kind of garner our resources and our abilities around how we make this document say what it is that we can generally agree with and not run into the briars and brambles and difficult challenges.
This is Myron, and I agree that there's no way we're going to be able to account for every single fact pattern, every single scenario. But what I think most of us would be happy with is a time where we could apply to 80% of the problem or something like that. And I think that's the issue, is that there are these situations where a vast majority could be answered by a few fact patterns and scenarios without having to cover every single one. And, that might be victory.
Yeah, I think the other issue to wrestle with, or at least to acknowledge, is the fact that while we've teased apart each of these different problem statements, with respect to donations, with respect to manufacturer credit, with respect to recalls, we tease them apart for purposes of trying to discuss them in their unique sort of element and grapple with kind of what drives each of those individual components. There are possible approaches of solutions, or at least models that could be derived that could, while on one hand, this one partial, whatever percent, I couldn't tell you, but whatever percent could be resolved through guidance, it may not speak to a variety of other circumstances, which may actually also benefit from a broader solution, which we have yet to characterize in this document, which ultimately recognizes that all of these materials are being managed in a similar fashion. So are there other broader solutions that could encompass and not necessarily have to be in the silo of that particular problem statement? So again, we can't lose sight of that as well. So, but so some of this is the challenge of, and the unique element of trying to look at this in its isolated element that doesn't necessarily, lend to kind of coming up with holistic or 100% solutions. So then the question is, how much of a solution is enough of a solution to be offering as a recommendation here? That I don't know. Anyway, I'm sorry, I'm rambling. I feel like I'm rambling. I know I'm rambling. I'm rambling in my rambling. So sorry. So I'm trying to come up and help us to grapple with a strategy for this document that can lead us into a place where as many people who can at least agree on certain elements of it can agree, leaving aside for a moment the areas where they feel important to maintain a line of position and an important distinction between what they see, the different interests and stakeholders. But again, gets us to a point in this document that gets at least what we need it to do, which is to establish that, as we all recognized over the many years we've been talking, there are problems. SB 423 kind of directed us to kind of come together and do this. It also directed us to come up with ways to reduce the amount of materials that are becoming waste, to come up with ways to assist retailers in making these very difficult determinations. So I mean, I'm kind of trying to keep sight of the overall overarching goals and objectives that we have, that we were charged with through the bill. So anyway,
So I don't think anybody is suggesting abandoning the overall goals and objectives and working towards consensus, or trying to solve every problem. But if we can solve one problem, and it sounded to me like this hypothetical was one that was susceptible of a clear answer, and why should we, do you have an objection to putting that in there as something that, here's a hypothetical and here's how it works?
I have no objection to putting in a hypothetical. My only experience here is that what seems like it's consensus and seems like it might be easily stated and agreed to, we'll have to bear that through. We'll have to put it on paper and see what we can.
But let's get the hypothetical in there, and I'm happy to write up the hypothetical that I described, and Jay can take a crack at the response, and Ed can have his input, and Heidi and Myron and the man in the moon. But to me, that was a constructive discussion that we had, and let's capture that.
Like I said, and I think it does become an example of areas where there are circumstances, and it doesn't necessarily define the universe of all circumstances, but I think if we can offer it, and in offering it in this report, becomes an opportunity to at least have that one defined. I agree.
Great.
Rick, I wanted to share a thought regarding, you asked about what goes into this document, and the regulated community, the regulators seem to be two of the greatest spokespeople for each position. However, we have multiple positions that maybe have not been called out on all of these meetings, and I think it's a responsibility in constructing this document that we look for all the strengths that we've found throughout these meetings and make sure that they are clearly articulated in here, even though those positions may have some opposition at different parts. But it also is important to make sure we represent as many positions as possible and try to avoid I'm sorry, I don't mean to do this, but a us versus them kind of technique. And I think it's important that we get to see
is now joining
thoughts before this document is finalized. Well, and I appreciate that, Megan. And like I said, I don't disagree on it, overall, but I think in some ways, as I stated before, I think the us versus them, in terms of positions, in terms of concerns, in terms of statements, essentially does define. I mean, that is the essence of the problem we're grappling with, which is there's disagreement on this. There's disagreement on what the best way to manage these things are. So I think in some ways, trying to hammer something into consensus may actually mute or otherwise dilute the nature and importance and severity of the problem that's being grappled with. And so therefore, I leave open this possibility that it's the presentation of the information in this document may actually be strengthened by its presentation of varying viewpoints rather than trying to hammer into a consensus. I said, let's approach each of these with that eye to see whether or not that is a helpful technique.
So Michael will send you a draft hypothetical, Jay, and you and Ed and others will work on a response, and we'll see if we make progress. Can we maybe move to the next agenda item with that understanding?
Yes. Is there anything else on the donations and stuff? Any other comments before we go?
Did we want to try to
just
make
a hypothetical?
Do we want to try to make a couple of edits to that one paragraph that Matt had pointed out?
Right.
There were a couple of other comments that were shared about, in terms of the definition, or at least the definitions of expired or other elements. And like I said, at this point, the document contains only federal references. And I think the point raised and well taken is that to the extent that there are California law citations that also govern, if it's consistent, then that's fine. But again, as is typically the case for California, there's differences of substance. And so to the extent that there's California law references that should also be cited and included, that would be important to do so.
I was actually going to suggest that at page 6, that section about what does expired mean and the rest of that just be taken out, because I don't think it really speaks to what we're trying to do here is as far as the donations and products and generation. But up to you guys. Let me know what you think.
I'm sorry, I'm not sure I understood. What did you
On
want?
page 6, we have, it starts off with what does expired mean? Varies, food products, FDA,
Yeah,
and all that.
I agree, that doesn't belong here. And
Does it really belong here in
Well,
this discussion, right? As far as when.
It does if you're trying to argue or at least presenting that something is not donatable if it's expired, and that there's confusion around what is expiration and how is expiration defined and whether or not.
I hear
something
you.
is
I mean, I
recent.
guess this is the problem of dividing this up, because we're going to get to the manufacturer credit statement, and we certainly have things to say about whether things that are expired are automatically waste, which you're saying here they automatically are, and that hasn't been the interpretation that lots of people have operated on for a long time, and there's lots of settlement agreements that allow people to not consider expired things waste. So this is again the issue about dividing this into different issues. For purposes of donations, maybe it's one thing, but we're going to talk about credit, and I'm not going to agree there that just because it's expired means it can't be sent to a reverse distributor, because that's not been the policy in most other states or EPA's policy, and it hasn't been what the DAs have put in settlement agreements. So.
And Scott, I get that. I guess to be fair to Jay, it's like the concept of expired was in the previous version, so that was not added to or otherwise changed. So the issue of expiration in the context of donation has been a fundamental part of it.
Okay, and if you'll agree not to change anything that was in the last version, then I will agree.
No.
Why are you telling me that?
Scott, you're missing the point.
Wait a minute. So Scott is speaking to the issue of what is the consequence of being an expired product. I'm the one who came up with this stuff to try to answer the question that was raised several months ago as to what does expired mean and how do you tell whether something's expired? And so what this is intended to do is to distinguish, for example, a best if used by date from a true expiration product is, not to be consumed by a human, like an expired drug. All this does is provide that information and background. Now, when we get to the credit statement, or maybe even in the donation context, there might be a disagreement about whether a product that is technically expired in the sort of extreme sense, as opposed to the other end of the spectrum, which is the best used by date. What the implications are, we'll need to sort that out, but at least we ought to know what we're talking about. So it strikes me as odd to take this out, whether it belongs here or someplace else. Don't we all need to have a common understanding of how expired and best if used by and all those terms are used and what they mean, whether they have legal import?
And Michael, I don't disagree with you, but again, going to the top of page 3, the idea, at least in the context of this document, was to state that products that are not capable of being donated or salvaged are defined in part by whether they are expired such that, with the original version, such that donation or salvage is unlawful. So again, Michael, coming back to your point, I agree with you that the definition of an understanding of what is expired and the kind of putting context around that. So I guess I'm disagreeing with Jay that I don't believe we should excise all of that information. I think it's important to help define what it is that statement means.
Okay, so just to clarify, what we said, at least in an earlier draft, and was that it can't be donated if it's expired. That's different than saying it's a waste. To me, it's different. I think it's different and has been the policy of the United States Environmental Protection Agency that it's different for a while. Now, there's a proposed rule that says, it may say other things about when things become a waste, but the policy of the United States Environmental Protection Agency, and maybe some of them are on the phone,
is now exiting,
has been that you can ship expired products. So I'm not going to say it's a waste because I don't think that's true. If you want to say that in your part of the report, this may be a place where we have to disagree. But it's different to say it can't be donated than to say that it's a waste. Those are different statements, and I agree with one of them, but not the other.
As far as something being expired, there are probably scenarios out there that something is expired but it's still usable, or it's past its expiration date but it's still usable somewhere or can be sold or still be used. So I don't necessarily think that it would be waste just because it's expired. So that,
Yeah,
that's,
so what
you know,
we
you
had
have
in
to
the
look at
earlier
all
version
the
that you
facts
were.
around it, right?
So yes, so Scott, maybe I'm misunderstanding the purpose of the bullets that were offered there that was essentially limited what was able to be donated under the context of this write-up.
Yeah,
'Cause
no,
there
but you're right, though. The bullet was expired such that donation or salvage is unlawful.
Right.
So we were saying that if it's expired such that donation or salvage is unlawful, it cannot be sent for donation or salvage. Does that make sense? I don't think there's any disagreement about that.
So we've jumped to that means it's a waste.
Well, that's not what we said in our,
I'm not saying
it
it's
wasn't
a
what we
waste.
said.
Okay, well,
So,
Well, again, I mean, I guess the confusion then that raises.
it's not what we said, but it's what it says now. In addition, products are likely to be a waste when they can no longer be used or sold as intended, and the expiration is passed as one of the list. So there's been a change, and we're just saying we don't like it.
Are you okay with that?
No, I'm not okay with it,
Okay, well,
because I don't think that it's, I mean,
so it's two-part, right? It's one, it's no longer usable for its intended purpose, and it's expired. Those are two different things, right? But if you have both that meet those requirements in a product, it's both unusable and it's also expired, then likely it's going to be a waste. I'm not saying it is, but we have to look at all the other facts in there, right?
but it goes down to when it's a waste, right? So, read the Merck letter. The Merck thing, they say there, a lot of the products went back and they couldn't be resold, and that was fine. It was not a waste at the different Merck facilities until it went back to the centralized location.
And I'm not saying it is a waste.
Okay.
I'm saying these are some of the factors that somebody should consider whether or not something is a waste, and that's kind of what we're putting, what I'm putting.
Maybe our likely is too strong then. Maybe it's may.
Okay. All right, me.
I'm going to interrupt here for a second. It's 11:15 and we need to finish the agenda of about 6 more items. So are we going to talk only about donations and manufacturer's credit today so that I can let the group know that we are going to continue with the rest later? I know we're looking at number 6 also because we're trying to talk about what goes in report 2.
Right.
So if it's a consensus here today for this meeting that we're going to cover on the manufacturer's credit, then Marvin and I may have to move this item on empty containers again to next meeting. Is that okay with you?
I mean, that's fine. I mean, I think it's just going to be a consensus thing as well. And we just may have to find a different way of including it, whether it means it's part of the facts and findings and recommendations part of it or some other discussion. It's in there as well. But, for me personally, we don't have to cover it today.
Okay, thank you. We hope we can do everything. So let's get started with donation and manufacturer's credit, then let's continue and we'll see how we go. Thank you.
Any more discussion on the donate? Again, clearly there's additional feedback that needs to be offered and brought together in a document. The challenge will be whether or not it needs a conversation before pen is put to paper, or whether it's possible to do this electronically, because it sounds clearly there may be some, from the appearance, there may be some competing views that one would write it one way, one would write it another, and neither is necessarily going to agree that with the writings potentially of the other. So I'm okay with kind of continuing to share, written feedback, but I don't know what the possibility is of coming to resolution or consensus through, or even resolution. Let's set aside a consensus.
So my personal suggestion would be that we work on the hypothetical, and we got these comments fairly recently. Give us a chance to suggest some modifications, and we'll see if we can reach consensus.
Okay. And recognize, I think. Okay, go ahead. Sorry.
No, that's fine.
I think some of the recitation of law can be put into an appendix, because I think we don't necessarily need to repeat and restate inside any of these particular documents, but we can use that as a common reference, because I think the definition of waste covers and kind of transcends all of it. The definition of recyclable material transcends all of it. So, and the relevant other standards and regulations also kind of transcend and work through the entirety. So to the extent that that can work us to some measure of brevity in some of these, that might be helpful as well. Okay. So Scott, your offer is appreciated. So if to the extent you can work with, get feedback to the document to Jay, and then we will kind of work with you on that.
Thank you.
Okay, great. So we'll move on to manufacturer's credit then. And Scott, to you.
So thank you, Nina. At the last session, we had, I think, a good discussion on manufacturer's credit, and I think Rick suggested that the current statement did not accurately reflect the variety of issues associated with it, and so we revised it. And it seemed like the best place to put it was in the current draft of the report. Again, I want to acknowledge Ed's point that, and Michael's point that this was a proposal for a consensus, and no one thinks that, since y'all are just seeing it, no one thinks you've signed off on it, but we did want to, take Rick up on his suggestion and revise it to reflect the discussion. Tried to, and certainly open to suggestions if I failed, but tried to state different parties' positions along the way here. As industry says this, or regulators have said this, or we try to do a lot of attribution here. Again, if we missed one or two, please call that to our attention. But the revision was, again, I don't want to repeat the whole last week's discussion, but it was really in line with last week's discussion. First, we start off by just describing the problem of unsellable consumer products and the issue of credit, and include some factual information about, the value that these bring to retailers. We talk a little bit in the next paragraph about why reverse distribution has been used. I think Ed had a lot of questions about, why is it done this way? Could it be done a different way? And so we try to address those in this paragraph, specifically that, the alternatives that were suggested. Could manufacturers provide, visit each store? Could retailers apply credit on their own? We try to address all those and why this is the system that has, developed over the last 30 years and operates in many states. So again, just trying to answer the questions that we heard in the room. We talked a little bit, another point that we talked about last time was the collateral benefits of the existing system. I think it was suggested that we hadn't done a good job of explaining that before, so we try to go through and talk about, this is the system that also pays for donations, and that issue. We also think there's a beneficial environmental impact of the credit system in terms of the fact that the trucks that go from the distribution centers to the stores come back with product and go back to retailers, so there's quite a bit of efficiency there. We also think in this last point that you're looking at now on the bottom of the page is a point that EPA has made in its comments along the way, that there's this can be a complicated area, and you've heard many times retailers allude to the difficulty of training seasonal workers and high school students to make complicated hazardous waste determinations. So we think that's an issue. You're going a little too fast for me. Sorry, Matt. And then we talked about, this was a new section we've alluded to in the recall section, but we thought it was worth mentioning here. Reverse distribution is not something that was sort of dreamt up overnight. It's an established system. It's referenced in the regulations of many of your federal agencies. And we cite to those here just to make it easy for you to find. Reverse distributions in the DFT rules, it's in the FDA rules, DEA rules. Consumer Product Safety Commission has guidance for reverse logistics, so it's an established industry that serves a lot of different functions, and we thought it was important to point that out. We also attached a summary of EPA guidance on this issue, which you all have seen, I think, last year, but we recycled it for current purposes. I'm sure not all of you take federal guidance applies here, and you might even disagree with how we characterize it, but I'm sure you'll let me know if you do. But we tried to provide in one place a summary of the Merck letter and some of the other guidance that has guided us over the last 30 years and guides us in other states. you can scroll down a little bit. The problem, we tried to really address both sort of the general issue and then specific context. A general issue is that retail stores don't really know what's going to happen to the products when they leave the store. They just know that they're not selling there, and they've been told to send it to somebody else who will deal with them. And that's, as we've pointed out, and you've seen presentations, disposal is a very small part of that overall, but it can be part of it. So we have this general issue of things being returned to the reverse distributor, and sort of like we had on the donation side. Do you have to know before you send it what's going to happen to it, or is, what do we do about the reality that people don't know? And then we try to get into the specific issues of expired products and what we call destroyed dispositions. Those are specific instances where, arguably somebody somewhere knows what's going to happen to the product. We've talked before, if it can't be sold legally, it's probably going to end up being destroyed. It might, not in every case, but it might be. And then we have particular kinds of products that some manufacturers want to destroy, and we spent a lot of time, last time I tried to explain why that is. There are good reasons for that, some of which we should care about. Things like manufacturers being worried about knowing where their products end up from a liability perspective, wanting to make sure that their products are pulled off the shelves appropriately, which is really hard to do if they're on the third or fourth or secondary market. They want to be able to recall them. So there are health and safety and liability concerns that are not just economic concerns, but things that should matter to policymakers. So we tried to articulate those. If you would scroll down a little bit there, Matt, I kind of jumped ahead on you a little bit further. Okay, so there's where we talked about the expired products and destroyed dispositions. A little bit more, please. Keep going. Okay, so then we have the consequences paragraph, which actually hasn't changed very much, not surprisingly. And we tried to explain, well, what happens if we say that you can't use reverse distribution for credit anymore in the state of California. We think that obviously gets rid of the benefits that we described above, including the important collateral benefits. So we're trying to lay that out here. And as I said last time when I was talking with Rick, we can approach this from a couple of different perspectives. We think we've explained why reverse distribution makes sense, but we've also tried to explain, we think it's important for those who want to get, who would challenge what we're trying to do, to explain why this is a problem. What is the environmental benefit that you get by making people throw away things at the store instead of shipping them in accordance with DOT regulations to somebody else who can give them a chance to find a home and will dispose of them properly when they get there. So I think that's a pretty good description of what's there.
Is now exiting.
Not everybody had a lot of time to read this, so we would definitely want to get comments on it either today or after the meeting. Would very much welcome further input on it. Thank you.
Thank you, Scott.
Thank you, Scott. This is Ed Ochoa. I had a question. I haven't had a chance to review the document, but I did notice that DTSC's notice of a meeting from yesterday included something that was referred to as EPA guidance on reverse distribution. And I just wanted to clarify that. It looks like it was the retail industry's interpretation of EPA regulations and positions.
Right. Like I said, and I think is said here, and I think I mentioned a second ago, we prepared a summary of EPA guidance, correct?
Yeah, because the document doesn't indicate that, and like I said, it's referred to as EPA guidance. But I think
where is it referred to as EPA guidance?
Well, it's referred to as EPA guidance in the notice that we received, that the working group members received. When I'm looking at DTSC's website, it says EPA guidance on reverse distribution.
Okay. We will, Ed, this is Ray. We're going to correct that. So again, it was not intended to, and so we'll clarify that on the web posting to recognize that it was provided. It's essentially a summation by the retail industry of the.
And we made that clear when we sent it. Maybe the name of the document could have been different, but I think it was clear when I sent it and when Myron forwarded it that it was our summary. So I'm sorry if that sounds like it wasn't as clear as it could have been on the website, and it sounds like we'll fix
It's
that.
definitely, yeah.
This is Nina. It never went on our website. It's just in the email for a clarification for everybody. We just sent out what we received, and that's what we were saying, that we are sending out all these documents that we just received from you.
Right.
So that included that. So
Right.
it's
So it
not
was-
on our website.
Yeah, I think in the context it was clear was our summary.
No,
and we
no,
were
it
sending
is on
to
the
you.
website. Just to clarify, Nina, I'm looking at DTSC's website for the agenda, and I'm looking at the document that's entitled EPA Guidance on Reverse Distribution.
Okay, sorry, Ed. I'm going to move this on to Matt. Matt, can you answer that?
So take it down, Ed.
Also, in the title, does it also say industry provided?
Yes, it says industry provided, but it says EPA guidance on reverse distribution, in parentheses, industry provided, which is vague in itself, right? That is the industry providing EPA's guidance, or is the industry providing its view on EPA's guidance, right? So it's just not clear.
No, I appreciate that. We will retitle it on the website so it's clear that its source and what it represents. So our apologies for any confusion or ambiguity through our posting. So we'll take care of that. Are there any other? Is there any initial feedback to Scott on his document, or at least the attempts to redraft? And again, Scott, appreciate the effort you put into this and responsiveness to at least the prior discussions.
Okay, great. No more comments on that one? Oh, we are doing good. So we have to move on to, we get to Myron's topic of.
I'm sorry, before you go on, can we set a date for people to comment on that? Or should we just come back at the end? I just want to make sure that whatever time you guys agree it is, 11 o'clock or 12 o'clock.
Clearly, the end of this process is approaching fast. So the idea of how we're going to integrate all of the various feedback into anything time is of the essence. I think we all need to be focused on how do we get information and feedback back, and how do we come to some agreement on the content, scope, and purpose.
Is now exiting.
So, Jay, you had a point?
I did have a question, Scott. I'm sorry I haven't gone through what you've put together, but I wanted to ask if you considered the speculative accumulation issues that might come up in this kind of scenario, as far as, if somebody is if let's say the retailer is bringing the waste back to the reverse distributor, and I guess that kind of goes to the destroy dispositions too, right? But if, let's say, it's going back there, how do we define what would possibly be speculative accumulation?
Yeah, I would think, don't those rules kick in once it becomes a waste?
Well, one of the definitions for waste is when it's inherently waste-like, and if you go further in that regulation, it refers to that speculative accumulation. So that's kind of one of the issues I think we need to look at, as far as if something is.
Yeah, I'll take another look at that, and maybe you and I want to talk about offline, make sure I understand the point. Thank you.
Okay, we move on to partial and partially empty containers, item number 5. So, Myron?
So I just wanted to also make a comment regarding the information that's on there. It was not sent out separately. It was included in the findings recommendations, just because that was where it was probably the fastest way to get that. So of course there's ways that it could have been discussed earlier and have a little more feedback. So my apologies for if there's additional input. We definitely welcome that additional input. This is based on the recommendations or feedback that I received, and I incorporated into here. So I just wanted to make that clear up front that this is not the end result of anything that the subcommittee put together. So I went through, and similar to the other aspects on the problem statement issues that talked about partially empty containers, gave some background about that, where one of the problems that has been provided is that there are just millions of these bottles and containers that are going in that are partially empty, and that they're being treated as hazardous waste because of what it may have contained at a point in time, and that there are some issues with regards to some of the guidance from DTSC as to when a container is actually empty. So this problem statement tries to identify and define more clearly what those issues are. So to start with, in the problem, talked about that exerted from the DTSC guidance on when a container is considered empty. And it talks about, and I'll just summarize that basically when a container is inverted and from any orientation, that there is no more liquid flowing from that container, and that basically becomes a drip, then it will be considered to be empty. So that comes from the guidance. Go ahead and scroll down. So part of the problem with that is that when is that moment in time taken? When is it that the last drop is considered to be a drop? Because one of the things that can happen is that for especially thick, viscous liquids, when they're in the container and you get to a point where, and this is just based on things that are happening in actual practice, that when you have inverted and it reaches a point of when it is no longer flowing in a continuous stream, but is dripping out of it, and then you can put it right side up and put it to the side, or even just leaving it on the side, leaving it to the side. There are some materials that will adhere to the sides of containers, and that at a later point in time, you can come back to that container and orientate that in such a way that additional liquid will flow from it. And so it is no longer dripping, but flowing from that. So that causes kind of an inherent, where is that point in time? Get back to scroll up a little bit, please. More, please, yes. So the consequence of that I briefly alluded to is that when you have this uncertainty of when is it completely empty, then it causes issues as to when can you dispose of it without it being, when can you properly dispose of a container. So, there's, we had some discussion about interpretations and kind of points of views, and this is one of those ones where, when is that? Is it the first time that it begins to drip? Is it the last time it begins to drip? And so, what it leads to is that you have a point in time where it may never be empty if you can always turn it in such a way that it is going to flow from it. So that in some ways undermines the guidance itself, because if you take that to its conclusion, then you would have a point in time where you always are having to check whether it's flowing from the container or not. And then, all the way to the point of where it actually goes into the landfill. And so what we've tried to address is outline the problem, and then maybe look at some ways that we could address that and maybe find a way to fix that point in time. So I know we're not talking about solutions yet, so we don't have to cover that part, but that was as part of the recommendations and findings that some of these problem statements had solutions in there, and that was what the solution part tried to address is when do we, how do we measure that? And again, it's not the final proposal or the final definition. It's just a proposal of a couple ways that we can try to address that. And these are, so this matrix part, this was how, and maybe we can, review this and make sure that this is captured in the previous part, but originally we were in this matrix and that's why that's in here, but it's supposed to, the above part was supposed to summarize that.
Thank you, Myron. Do you have any questions on the problem statement that Myron presented?
I'm sorry, this is Eric. Yeah, I just wanted to know, I'm just quickly scanning the statement, and it's a bit confusing to me because it's referring to, it used to say empty, and mostly empty containers, I guess. Now it's partially empty containers. The regulation at issue actually defines the issue as, and a definition for non-empty, right? And so a container that's used to contain or contains hazardous waste is considered, quote, non-empty under the various ways in which the regulation defines non-empty. So I think it would be helpful to include a reference to the regulation that identifies the various ways in which a container can be considered, again, non-empty. So the operative word isn't mostly empty or partially empty, but non-empty. And if the container is considered non-empty, then it is regulated as called for in the regulation. So I'm not sure that that's the point that's jumping out in this draft guidance, and I understand that this is an issue for some of the retail companies that have faced this issue in the context of regulatory enforcement. But that's just something that's quickly jumping out at me.
Okay, well, I'll look at that and rewrite that.
So Myron, I guess this is Rick. One overarching consequence then, if I can, in reading through this, is that containers that you're arguing are difficult to truly empty per the regulatory standard for empty would then ultimately be considered non-empty and be required to be managed as hazardous waste. So the ultimate consequence is the regulation of these materials as hazardous waste, which what you would say is it's over-regulation or unnecessarily regulated or impractical to get them to an empty condition.
Correct in that, if you want to compare that to what, federal guidance says, and it gives a certain percentage or certain level, then, that's a very easily objective measurement. It turns out that what probably was intended to be objective is actually not so objective when you're talking about different types of materials that potentially hazardous materials that are in the container.
So, but the ultimate consequence is these containers, while there are regulations, end up being managed as hazardous waste.
That is correct.
And then if the question mark that you're raising is, should they be?
Yes.
Rick, Larry Sweetser here. It's also a case of where do you draw that line on empty? My examples are always like used oil containers, you let them drip. You think they're done, you go back later, they drip some more. So at what point can it be empty without rinsing? The other one is like roofing tar. Roofing tar, you never get the container clean. There's always a residual. The common interpretation had been if it's dried, usually less than an inch, sort of adapting the EPA rule, that's usually been empty enough. And a lot of things that have gone on with this have kind of called that into question on when we draw that line, particularly from our perspective when we find it in household facilities or in the garbage. So that's what I'm hoping to get some clarity on at some point.
Myron, you also include a reference, at least in near the third from the last, materials dried with less than an inch of residue that are practically empty if the top is also dried. So you refer to paint. So are you essentially saying that if it has a skin that is formed, regardless of whether there may still be some liquid form or portion underneath that skin, that's one where you believe shouldn't be identified or should be identified as empty? Or to help me understand kind of how you're, at least what your intent here is.
So the subcommittee didn't really come to a consensus as to like what making a recommendation on these types of aspects. It's really as I received examples and scenarios, then I just included them to kind of flesh out what kinds of problems people are facing. So it's not really necessarily a recommendation as to whether that is or isn't. It's just a comment that I received.
Okay.
And that was actually my comment in there, and that was my roofing tar or even oil-based paint. We found in practice that if you have more than an inch in the bottom of that container, a paint can, and there's a crust on top, there's no guarantee that it's going to be solid underneath for something like oil, roofing tar, something that's volatile. It'll form that crust, and if you poke a screwdriver through it, it'll
Still
soft.
retains
But
liquid,
if it's usually if it's an inch or less than an inch, practice has been it's pretty much dried all the way through. I mean, there's always exceptions. Latex paint, you can have many, many inches and it's completely dry, but a guideline has been that 1 inch rule, less than an inch.
Again, Larry, as you're pointing out, guidelines are always very difficult because we had a lengthy discussion on other guidelines. Everything is fact-based and it's going to be material specific as to whether or not that rule of thumb leaves you with paint on your thumb. So, sorry. Any other comments? Again, Myron, I appreciate the work that the group put into this. Like I said, we will kind of at least give you some feedback on this in terms of defining, at least enough to get us to a problem that there may need, recommendation of, DTSC to look further at its empty container regulations and kind of do what it can to offer clarity or address some of the ambiguity and challenges that retailers and others with empty containers face.
That's what we hope.
Okay. Okay. As long as we can agree that you're not necessarily asking for a fix at this moment, other than a concerted effort to look. So we're good. Okay.
Thank you, Byron. Thank you, Rick. So now we move on to item number 6, the findings and recommendation report. And I know we have been discussing that in and out, but it's open to all to give your views. And we got the comments, as we mentioned earlier before, from Michael and Myron. And if there are any other ones, that would be good to receive so that we can start putting it together. Anybody has any other comments on that? Please feel free to speak up now and send it to us.
Yes, John Benton, just back on the prior, Myron, just on the prior issue there, is that a guidance interpretation thing from a regulatory agency that is going to clarify that issue, or is that a legislative issue that maybe need to be addressed down the road?
I think, getting back to at least a partial point that Ed made, which is most of this emanates from this explicit regulatory definitions for empty and non-empty. So from my estimation, the best approach would be to look at and further clarify in regulations so that our practice, I can't speak to history, but our practice is not to issue through policy or guidance anything that differs from a regulatory or statutory standard. It's just, it becomes a very difficult, if not, it's a problematic approach to things, which doesn't leave any guarantee or any certainty in the future. So our preference would be, and I think in this particular case, I think the regulation is the best place to focus. It also gives us a deliberative process through which we could put out proposals, seek public comment and feedback from all stakeholders, and get us to resolution so that we could potentially take into account all of those scenarios or types of waste to the extent we can. Yes. That would be in Title 22. Obviously, 40 CFR has its own empty standards, which I don't believe you have taken exception to.
One other comment I wanted to raise, and the regulation I'm speaking to is in Title 22, of course, 66261.7. So all folks understand that that's the regulation I was referring to. And the other point I wanted to make is this is actually an exemption, right? So if a container is considered is not empty, right, double negative, it's still subject to regulation, so it's a conditional exemption. And so there are other provisions that apply other than the subdivision B of that regulation that defines the various ways in which something is considered non-empty. So it's a more involved process, and the regulation is conditional, meaning if it is empty, that doesn't mean that you can just toss it out. There might be some conditions that apply that the regulated industry should be aware and probably is aware, right?
Okay. All right. Now have we finished on empty containers? Sorry. So clearly, we will be looking at, and appreciate again, Myron, the effort on this, and we'll look at that and provide feedback and comments. In terms of the findings and recommendations, I think we need to kind of take a close and concerted effort here, considering whether or not we have or even remotely might possibly come to consensus on any of the problem statements. Will also probably define for us even further the likelihood or unlikelihood of coming to resolution or common ground on recommendations that come from this, other than some of the broader concepts that we've discussed. But what is the solution for any of these? And I think this might be where we entertain the idea of just compiling from different stakeholders and constituencies their various recommendations for how one, several, or all issues could be resolved through a proposal that, from where you sit, you believe would be helpful to fix it. As a case in point, not an endorsement, but the idea that the use of reverse lit distribution could solve a number of these particular issues, not the empty container issue, but a number of other issues that, again, have been represented in the various problem statements as an example. So to the extent that there's agreement that there is a problem, which ultimately is kind of the foundational element here. If there's agreement that there's a problem, and I guess the call for each of the participants in this work group is, do you agree it's a problem, and what would you offer as a solution if you agree it's a problem, in light of the overarching goal of this work group, which was to essentially reduce the amount of wastes which are or the consumer products that are being managed as waste unnecessarily. So again, I encourage you to look back at the enabling statute here so we can focus on what our goal and responsibility is, because I think all of us occupy a particular responsibility in this network of regulation, whether it is an obligation to comply or an obligation to enforce. So none of that is in question here. The question is, if there is a solution that can be offered to advance the goal that the bill set forward, how do we accomplish that?
So does that mean DTSC has the pen on this right now?
I think what I'm offering is that all of us have the pen on this. I think that each of us should be encouraged to offer, if there's a solution statement for one in particular that you feel strongly about, or alternately you have a solution that can be encompassing, that this is an opportunity for us to, again, not for attribution placed into the document, and we can look for common ground and commonality so that we can consolidate recommendations.
Rick, in the draft report that we put together, or the comments that we made on pages 25 and following, we did put in some recommendations, which obviously are, from our perspective, not owned by anyone else, but it was intended to sort of get the ball rolling on this.
Is now joining.
Okay. So perhaps if people can look at that, and we'll relook at it in light of today's discussions, at least gives a running start.
Is now exiting.
Okay. Can I ask, there's a highlighted blue section in it. Is that?
Yeah.
Who is that for? It's an alternative. It's proposed as an alternative, but
yeah. And I'm not sure.
At least to attribute here whose is whose.
This is all from the retailer group.
Collective,
And
okay.
there's a short version, which is the first paragraph, and there's a longer, more involved version. And we just didn't have time to even come to internal resolution, so I just stuck them both in there.
Okay.
You know, this is definitely a discussion document. In fact, I think it says so on every single page. So,
So I guess my question in with respect to the blue, it is offered in the context of donations and salvage, but as I quickly scan through it, it's not necessarily limited in and of itself to the donations and salvage. It seems to be a broader capture of a solution that could be encompassing of multiple of these, correct? Am I reading it correctly?
I think you are. I think this sort of takes off from an earlier version. Frankly, I apologize, I can't remember where this came from. But it takes off from an earlier version that related to 423, I think. We're sort of building in
Is now joining.
more conditions that would need to be satisfied, and it's an open question to me whether we need more conditions or not, whether that just adds complexity and burden or has benefits. So it's just there for people to think about.
Right, but again, it's more of an encompassing solution that it covers multiples.
It goes
of the
beyond
problems.
the, yeah, you're right.
Right, so
You're right.
formatting wise, I guess I would offer that it be put after all of the individuals and maybe as a more encompassing offer of
Yeah,
a
that makes
solution
sense.
statement. Okay. Not that I'm endorsing it or agreeing with it.
No,
I'll
right.
just- And we will also look further at, like I said, we'll look and we'll try to provide some feedback here too.
Great.
We will provide feedback, not just try.
Thank you.
So what's the timing look like?
So our next meeting is scheduled for when, Matt?
Thursday, May 11th.
May 11th. And then we have one final one, the end of May, correct?
Yeah.
However, that should be just the last hurrah.
Right.
So May 11th is our next meeting. The hope and plan would be that we have all substantive feedback into the common document, I would say by the end of next week, so that it gives us all an ability on our end to ensure that we've compiled everything and then include our own edits and then have a week for everybody to digest.
It
And
would include edits as well by next Friday?
we will, if we only get them next Friday, we won't have anything for you
So
next
you're
Friday.
looking for another version for us? Yes, that's all I mean. Is on the, I mean, how are we working it from, we all
We
editing
have
at
our
the same
comments.
time? Right.
We might have some more in light of today's discussion, but I think mostly we're looking for comments from the people who haven't commented yet.
So if you're looking for additional comments from others, which may be the best place to start, DTSC needs those no later than next Friday so that we can turn around a draft early that next week to be able to then distribute. So our goal would be to distribute on Monday of the week following, which May 9th.
All comments by May 5th.
All comments by May 5th.
What day of the week is that?
I think that's 6, isn't it? Friday.
The 5th is Friday, right?
5th is Friday.
The 5th is Friday.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. I mean, how much more do we have? I mean, maybe we can try to push for Wednesday or Thursday of next week to get them more time.
You may not have many more comments yet until you see our comments, in which case it could open up additional.
Okay, but so then how is it going? So are we getting you the final version for you to review by next week and then you're editing?
No.
Okay.
We are, again, I feel as though the retailers have put their offerings for the most part on the table.
Right.
What we owe collectively is the rest of the work group, to the extent that they have not yet contributed, their feedback and comments on what the retailers have offered by next Friday. We will take any and all of those that feedback and comment and turn around a revised document that incorporates that feedback to the retailer's draft by May 8th,
Which is a Monday?
which is a Monday.
Could you make it Tuesday? Because we're out of town.
Oh, that's right, we are out of, okay.
Which would give everybody Monday to give us time.
Okay, so you have till Monday, May 8th. Again, I'm recognizing I've got other parts of my responsibilities I've got to balance. So till May 8th, to get us comments. We will turn around a revised document to all of you by May 9th.
But that's not going to include your, I'm
That
sorry.
will include our edits.
That'll, okay.
Again, what's happening next week is a compilation of all other feedback from all other work group members that wish to express feedback or comment on the retailer's document. That may include either just comments, original comments, or other kind of general statements or seeking of clarification, or
now exiting.
also, my desire would be it's offering as in terms of edits to the document. That said, neither one is necessarily going to be, it's still going to require some measure of work and effort to resolve and figure out.
That all sounds great, and we will probably have some comments too.
Okay.
Some edits that we'll make, and I think maybe we can do that sooner, because I would like to just go ahead and address some of the issues that Ed raised about not appearing to misrepresent who's saying what.
Okay.
So I'll give you those kind of ministerial changes.
Okay.
For example,
deleting
the word consensus. We can put it back in later if we get there, but let's start with,
Yeah, I'm just trying to see how that works, Michael, because ultimately that sort of change will possibly define what the nature of some of the edits would be. I mean, I can tell you that from my perspective, I'm not looking to alter your viewpoint. Right. It's not my role.
I think what Ed pointed out, and was I think an egregious example, that statement that he quoted should have had some attribution to it. Right. Absolutely. So we will take a stab at putting those. And I think when it comes to,
So I guess what that doesn't define for us is, as we're trying to compile other edits, if I don't have those edits to attribute or otherwise refine, define, or align those comments or text to someone who actually it attributes to, the comments offered by others are going to be on the text as is. So I'm going to be getting a convergence of feedback that ultimately could potentially conflict and or substantively change the comments we offer or edits we offer.
This is not a big, huge change, but we'll get it to you by Monday.
Okay.
And then you can recirculate for comment by the group next week. And stick with your
great.
schedule.
That would be appreciated. I'm just trying to.
I understand you don't want moving targets. Believe me, I understand.
Okay. Okay, Larry.
Simple question, just to make sure I'm on the same page. The comments are going to be on the document that was attached to the email.
No.
The clean version.
No, what Michael just offered is that they're going to do a quick attempt to do some additional modifications in light of our discussion today. We're going to have that on Monday. It will be distributed to the group on Monday, May 1st. That's the document that we are asking the rest of the group to look at and focus on. There will also be, from our perspective, some disclaimers and other language added so that people can feel comfortable that if they want to so distance themselves from this work product, that they can do so.
Okay, thank you. I just want to, yes, go on.
It just occurred to me that it's not, I don't think it's quite accurate the way here's what I'm concerned about, is that there are places where we say industry says this and prosecutors say that. I actually think that it's not quite that division. I think there are probably folks who are not in either of those groups or maybe people who are in one of those groups who agree with the other side. So I would encourage you, as you read something, just because it says prosecutors say that if you agree with it, you should make that clear. And same thing if by any chance the retailers have said something that someone other than a retailer agrees with, it would be nice for you to express that. Thank you, Jay. No, I mean, I think it's not providing an accurate picture. Especially when it comes to the problems, like we always say, well, the retailers have identified this as a problem. If there are people who are other than retailers agree it's a problem, it would be more accurate and I think helpful to the decision makers to understand that it's not just the retailers who say it's a problem. Because I've heard some prosecutors identify some things as problems, and I've heard folks who are not retailers say things are a problem. So I don't think we need to give a false dichotomy as though we don't agree on anything when there are maybe some things we're in. So that was my only.
And if I could offer a tag on to that, Scott, I think the problem as it stands needs to be cast in light of the bill language, which essentially narrows the focus of our efforts to not everything possible that is retail oriented, although we've been accommodating to address or take in additional sorts of concerns. But really it is in light of what is the charge, what is our goal that we're trying to accomplish, which is what factors contribute to products which could otherwise be used becoming waste and being managed in the waste management system. And are there techniques, ways, or approaches that could be offered that could reduce the unnecessary wasting and the unnecessary hazardous waste management of these products? I mean, we need to keep it focused on that, because I think there again, that could actually help define and better align the problem statement, understandings, and acceptance and agreement. If we all agree that there are circumstances, not in all cases, but there are enough circumstances that that is a true statement with respect to any of these, then we can at least have some acceptance and agreement that there is a problem. Because if we can agree there's a problem, then the rest of this at least becomes then, maybe more aligned with how do we may have differences of opinion as to how to fix it, but at least there's a recognition that this is a problem that may need to be addressed. Does that make sense? Okay.
Thank you, Rick. So with that, before we close, I'll just go over the action items. So the hypothetical will be provided by Michael to Jay, and Jay would comment on it. We would also get
now exiting.
Comments for any other additional comments on manufacturer's credit. And then for empty containers, we would like to get the inclusion of the reference to the regulation 66261.7. And for the report, we will get a draft of changes from Michael, and on May 1st, we should circulate that to the rest of the group to comment on that report. With
Romina Chef
is now exiting.
With that, I thank you all for coming today. And
Quickly, Nina
is now exiting.
All of the earlier action items can be incorporated into kind of the rest of the report writing. So please don't feel the need or that you need to provide other documents.
Is now
in this
exiting.
process. Let's just focus on the common drafts.
Right.
Thank you.
Rick. Thank you all.